welcome to Lakecity Live. I'm Kratika, and like most of our viewers out there, I too have been bored to death during history lectures at school. However, our guest for today deserves all the credits for amalgamating history, mythology and science in such a manner that has the youth enjoying antiquity afresh. Welcome to the show, Christopher.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm feeling great. I had a lovely session right now with the students, so it's and I believe they liked it, so that's important. I'm feeling good.
So as I mentioned that I've been a really poor student of history at school. I mean, I always thought that why do people just dwell in the past and not think about the future? Why do they make us study this? So, but after reading your book, I really went back and researched about all that you've written. And that had me, take interest in history. And talking about your book in general, people just read Mahabharata without trying to interpret what has been written in it. They just accept it as divine without trying to reason the events that have been mentioned in it. So this must be a very cliched question for you, but how did the idea of mixing mythology and science to create a literary piece come to you?
It's been a long journey. I mean, if I go back maybe about 20 years, I was reading a few non-fiction books which were written by Western authors, in which they explored Western mythology and tried to explain it using science and very similar mythological aspects. So in there they were talking about angels, for example, and they were saying the story was written by someone who didn't understand who these people were, but they weren't really angels. They probably had better scientific knowledge, and they were doing things involving science which the observer didn't understand. So when the person writing the story put it down, he put it down as divine beings that he was in contact with. And when I started looking at this, and there was a lot of scientific data, I wondered if one could do this with something like the Mahabharata, because you have a lot of very interesting and very fantastic stories in the Mahabharata which are not possible to explain if one uses pure logic. It sounds like it's either divine or supernatural, and things like that. And this was a very interesting angle which I saw. Only they were doing it using non-fiction. I decided to apply fiction. The difference being that I still wanted to use a base of real science and not science fiction, but make a fictional connect between the science and the Mahabharata. And just to see, would it be possible to actually explain some of those things that you hear about and read about in the Mahabharata using science? And that's really probably where it all started from.
So what about Mahabharata caught your fancy in the first place?
Well, first of all, it's an amazing epic. It's huge. It's extremely complex. There are stories within stories within stories. So one story can go down 4 or 5 levels. It gets so complex that when you're reading it, by the time you come to the 5th story, you've forgotten where you started.
About
in the
1
first
lakh
place.
shlokas you mentioned.
Yes. So it's very complex, and at the same time it's very real. If you just look at the description of the 18-day war, the Kurukshetra war, which is just one part of the Mahabharata, but every day of those 18 days is described in excruciating detail. I mean, the amount of detail that goes in is like, the best analogy I can think of is listening to a radio ball-by-ball commentary of a cricket test match.
That would be...
Every ball is described. So every arrow that is shot is described. How many arrows hit a person is described. And this is page after page after page. It's almost as if someone is watching and noting down what's happening over there and then describing, which is actually what's happening. Sanjay is relating what he's seeing to Dhritarashtra. But you always look back and say, as an author especially, if I was to write a story where I'd want to interest readers, I wouldn't make it so detailed. You'd skip and you'd say this happened and that's the end of it. But that caught my fancy. Some of the things like the Vimans, the celestial weapons, these caught my fancy, and I started thinking about, is there an explanation that one can find, a logical scientific explanation based on real science that can explain all these things?
Your first book, The Mahabharata Secret, talks about the Mahabharata and Samrat Ashoka. Yes. Your second book, The Mahabharata Quest, The Alexander Secret, talks about Alexander the Great, of course, with Mahabharata. And then there's also The Secret of the Druids that has Julius Caesar in it. Sort of all the historical characters, how do you choose the ones that you want to incorporate in your book?
A great question. So I, very honestly, so far, the characters have kind of chosen themselves. So in the first book, I was looking for I was looking for a historical figure who I could bring into the book, and then I stumbled up across this legend of Ashoka and his supposed secret society called the Nine
The
Unknown
nine,
Men.
yeah.
And when I discovered that, the legend itself was too, far-fetched to believe, because it talked about 9 books being written by these 9 men, subjects like microbiology, gravitation, which there's no evidence that in Ashoka's time they knew about microbiology, for example. In that case, for example, I said this legend is too far-fetched, so I converted it to suit my plot. And in the second case, again, I had determined that I was going to explain the Samudra Manthan using science. And then the logical character was Alexander the Great, because it is known that he sought immortality, and immortality was the essence of the Samudra Manthan, so it kind of clicked. And for the third one, again, I was very interested in the Druids and Julius Caesar, because I'd read about them some time back, and I had wanted to write a book where I connected them to each other and to the Mahabharata. And when I was doing my research for that book, it just kind of fell together. So I don't actually go out and hunt for characters, and say who can I link. It's, I think, more about just finding a very comfortable fit where there are question marks or mysteries associated with a historical character, and then trying to fit those together and saying, okay, is there a link I can provide, fictional of course, with the Mahabharata, and then make a story out of that.
If you just keep aside the matching of story and the facts and figures and everything, if you were just given a chance to write about one historical figure, what would that figure be?
Well, I've written about Alexander, so that was one figure
You really
I
wanted
always
to write
wanted to
about
write
it.
about, yes.
Okay, so every genre of writing has its own limitations, although fiction has comparatively less limitations because you can just play around with your imagination. But however, because you mix it with mythology and history, what are the limitations that you face so far in your writing?
So I think the biggest limitation, if you were to call it a limitation, is that everything I write about has to be credible. So there's a boundary which I can't cross where science is concerned. Because I'm basing everything on real science, real history, I have to ensure that the facts fit. And it's not always easy to create a story which is fictional using facts and then make them connect to each other in a way that appears credible.
That's a Herculean task, actually.
Yeah, so
if
that's
you
the
just
biggest,
think about
yeah,
it.
that's the biggest limitation, because it's you said, you can use your imagination, yes, but there's an extent to which you can't. So for example, if I want to say today, if I want to write about quantum physics, I cannot suddenly say that no, you have a quantum brother or a quantum sister, because the quantum laws do not apply in our real world. It applies only at the microscopic level. So that would be a limitation for me. And therefore I would have to figure out the theory, if I was using quantum physics, where I could delve into the world of quarks and atoms and subatomic particles, and yet relate it to our real world. So there's a big limitation over there, because that's where the credibility would either apply or suffer if I did something there.
How long on an average does it take for you to write a book?
Well, it takes about 2 years for the research itself. And writing the book, actually, I found, does not take a lot of time. I've written a book, I think on the average, anywhere between 3 to 4 months, just for the pure writing. The research takes a very long time.
Yeah, we know that you do extensive research and try to go to the places and visit them firsthand before you write. So what's the weirdest thing that you've ever had to research online for a book?
I don't research online at all, because a lot of what you find online is not validated. You'll find some crazy things online. You'll find things like, for example, fake verses from the Mahabharata, fake shlokas, which are used to justify the existence of nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata. There is nothing in the Mahabharata to justify imagining even that there are nuclear weapons described in the Mahabharata. So people say the Brahmastra is a nuclear weapon. It's not. not the way it's described in the
Of
Mahabharata.
course, that's the unbeatable weapon that
That
how
is.
it has been described.
Yes,
Of
but
course,
it's
no
not. It's not nuclear because it is used once in the Mahabharata, and there is no nuclear destruction described as a fallout of that. So it can't be nuclear. Yet there are fake verses online which say that this is there was nuclear weapons, usage of nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata. So there's a lot of junk online, and I try and stay away from that because it's very difficult to validate. What I prefer to do is read books by experts and read white papers, scientific white papers, and then cull out information from that. I validate everything that I research with experts in history as well as in science to make sure I've got my facts right, and then I write the book.
So you do it the old-fashioned way.
I do it the old-fashioned way.
Okay. I've observed this about thriller, that a thriller can very easily fall into two negative zones. It can either, the end can be very easily guessable for the reader, or on the other hand, the story can be so complex that the reader loses interest. A great piece of thriller lies in a very delicate balance wherein the story is not too complex yet gripping enough for the reader to want to continue it till the end. So this is actually a question for the aspiring writers out there. How do you nail that perfect balance every single time while also playing with so many characters?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for saying I nail it every single time. I'm glad to hear that. It's not easy. You're right. It's not easy. It involves a balance of various things, and inevitably the science comes into play towards the end. So finding that right balance is not easy. The way I look at it is, and I don't know whether this you could call it a tip or a suggestion for aspiring writers, but I like to end my books with a climax that should leave them. When they close the book, they should be saying, that was nice. And at the same time, it can't be over the top. So it doesn't, I wouldn't want it to be like a Hollywood movie where it's really, the climaxes are really over the top. You have planets exploding and stuff like that happening. But at the same time, it has to be big. So that's one thing. I think the ending has to have an impact on the reader. And more importantly, it has to tie up a lot of things. You leave a lot of clues in the book, and they should all come together towards the end of the book and come together in the climax. These two things are very important to keep in mind.
Especially when you're writing a trilogy like the Mahabharata Quest.
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay, so that was too much about the books. Let's just talk about you. What kind of books do you like reading?
Well, I like a very wide variety of books. Right now, I don't get too much time to read for leisure because there's so much to research. So I'm reading a lot of nonfiction nowadays. For the last 3-4 years, that's been the case. But I still like to, once in a while read science fiction or fantasy books. I've grown up with those. And then if there's a good suspense thriller, then I don't mind, picking that up and reading it.
Of course, nothing better than a book by yourself.
Oh yes, absolutely.
We recently found out that you play for a band called the Midlife Crisis. Although seeing your confidence, that does not reflect in the name of the band. Anyway, so you play for the Midlife Crisis, you have a consultancy, and you write. So typically my question here should be, is there anything that you don't do? But how does a typical day of yours look like?
It varies. It's work comes first, of course. So a typical day would be working with clients. Usually at their office, being a part of their meetings, and working with them. But there are times like this, for example, 2 days I've been in Bhopal. So here more of my time has gone on meeting, having sessions like the one I had today. I've had interacted with school children at a couple of schools over yesterday and today. So a lot of time has gone on that, and in between I've been catching up on emails or calls, related to work, and so it varies depending on what I'm doing. The 16th of April sees the launch of a new series, which is more based on fantasy. Again, it's a fantasy thriller series based on Indian mythology. So I'm going to be traveling a fair bit from the 16th. And there's going to be very little work getting done at that time because there are going to be launch events, book signings, interactions with the media for the book. So it really depends on what's happening at that point in time. But if you look to January, February, March, for example, I've done very little writing. I've just been doing more research and whenever I get time away from work.
Is that also one of the reasons why your book takes so long?
Yes, if I was doing full-time research, it wouldn't take 2 years. But I don't have a lot of time every day to sit and read all the books that I read. So it takes much longer because of that.
And this is the question of the hour. What is next for you? Like, tell us something about your next work.
So the next series that's being launched on 16th April is based on mythology, again Indian mythology. It's similar to the Mahabharata quest series in the sense that it's a thriller series again. It's set in modern times, not in the olden times, but there's again a connect with the past and the present. So the past is Indian mythology and the present is where the action happens. And it's about, I chose fantasy this time because, like you said before, fantasy has fewer limitations.
Yeah.
So you can actually do a lot. Though I've discovered that when you're writing on Indian mythology, even fantasy has its limitations because you have to stay true to what's there in the texts. Because unlike Egyptian mythology or Greek mythology, Indian mythology is living. It's something that people know about. So I can't take a lot of liberties with it, and therefore there's a limitation even there. But there's still a lot of stuff you can do. I don't have to stay true to scientific facts, for example. I can be a little more creative over there. So that's the new series. It's going to be as exciting as the Mahabharata quest series. It starts off with some inexplicable murders. It's got stuff like the use of mantras in it. I've done a lot of research on a lot of ancient texts, right from the Vedas to the Bhagavad Puran to the Gita, the Mahabharata, of course. And I've pulled in a lot of concepts from there into the book. So it's actually going to be very exciting.
I really have to comment on this. With the kind of research and the kind of book reading that you have, it must be very difficult for people to gift you books. Like, they'll have to come up with a new book to gift you because there's nothing left that you haven't read.
Well, I thank you. That's very nice of you to say that. But believe me, every time I come across a new book which I have not read, and I say, wow, there's just so much to discover and so much to learn that I would say I've just scratched the surface, very honestly.
Okay, so that was a great round. Now we have one interesting part for you, and that's called a book tag. And you have to very spontaneously answer a few of my questions. These are all about books. So this is basically a quiz for a book lover.
Great. I'm a book lover. Yes,
so let's start. Printed book or ebook?
Printed.
Paperback or hardback?
Paperback.
Online or in-store book shopping?
In-store.
Although I've never tried online book shopping.
I have tried online. Some of my books are not available in bookstores.
The wait is actually killing. I don't like waiting for my books.
Yeah, that's also there. That's also there. True.
If I've ordered it, I want it right now.
True.
So, trilogies or series?
Series.
Heroes or villains?
Both.
It can't be.
It can't be?
Yeah.
It depends.
Either heroes or villains.
Some of the heroes I don't like and some of the villains I really like. So
one of the villains that you like?
Now you ask me to try and remember. So one of the most memorable villains I have, and that's a case actually where both the hero and the villain are equally memorable, is Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty.
Oh, that was one amazing.
And if I ask me to choose, yes, okay, Sherlock Holmes would probably win in that case, but Moriarty is an amazing villain as well. So that's why both.
All right. A book you want everyone to read?
The Mahabharata.
Recommend an underrated book?
Oh, there's so many. Darwin's Radio by Greg Bear.
Okay. The last book you finished?
Very difficult to answer. I read 3 to 4 books at one time, sometimes 5 books at a time. So I've read about 120 books in the last 1 year. So
that's a massive number.
It's a massive number. So I'm trying to remember which is the last one. It could be this book called, it might be Egypt Before the Pharaohs. It's a book that talks about archaeological evidence before the first dynasty in Egypt started. So I was doing some research on that. So that's one of the books I've read recently.
The last book you bought?
Oh, I just bought a book called Pyramid Quest by Dr. Robert Schoch.
So you're in the Egypt?
Right now I'm researching a lot on Egypt, yes.
Okay. Weirdest thing you've used as a bookmark? Now, this is an interesting question.
Weirdest thing? That's a good question. I'll have lots of bookmarks. Not very exciting, I'm afraid, but I think the weirdest thing would be a boarding pass.
Okay. Used book, yes or no?
Yes.
Top 3 favorite genres?
Science fiction, fantasy, and mystery and suspense.
So, you're not very fond of romance?
Not at all.
Okay. Borrow or buy?
Preferably buy.
Characters or plot?
Plot.
Long or short books?
This is a trick question. Long. I'll go for long.
Long or short chapters?
Short.
Okay. Name the first book that comes to your mind when I say the following. On a rainy night, I'd be reading
Sherlock Holmes.
My Travel Companion.
My research books.
Solace in Difficult Times.
Oh, there's a lot. There's the Bible and the Gita. I think these two would be interesting. Yeah.
My Childhood Friend.
Isaac Asimov. Oh no, sorry. Jules Verne would be my childhood friend. Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. Our world or fictional worlds?
Fictional.
Audiobooks, yes or no?
No.
I'm not fond of it very much either.
No.
It's not the fun actually of having
reading
a book
it,
of
yes.
reading is
Yeah,
a little
absolutely.
bit lost in that. Do you ever judge a book by its cover? I've done it.
Do I ever judge a book by its cover? Yeah, I possibly I do. Yeah, yeah.
Book to a movie or book to a TV adaptation?
Actually, neither. A book is a book. You can't really adapt it.
An essence of it is actually lost.
Yes, it gets lost. You can't encapsulate. But if I had to choose between a TV series and a movie, I'd say TV series because you have more time to do justice to the book. So if I have to make a choice, it would be a television series or a web series.
A movie or a TV show that you've preferred to its book?
None I can think of.
Okay. Series or standalones?
Series.
Okay, so that was an amazing round, and it was great having you on the show. And thank you for sharing, all the information, all the knowledge, and telling us about your new book. It was just great having you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Stay tuned and keep watching Lake City Live.